The weekly Cybercrime and Business Podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hack Surfer's Weekly Podcast. Today is Friday, February 27th, 2015. Joining us for today's discussion, we have Mike Thel, Surfwatch Labs data analyst, Jeff Peters, the editor of Hack Surfer, and I'm Matt Lakemus, I write for Hack Surfer. Stay tuned after the podcast for Jeff's interview with Tim Matthews. Matthews is the VP of Marketing at Incapsula, and they talk about botnets and how they'll be affected by President Obama's proposed legislation. So I thought we'd kick it off today, guys, with some top news for the week. Starting out, we have a new king for the week, and not only was it the top new trending target, it was also the most discussed target over the last 7 days. And that's the Lenovo and Superfish stories and targets. We have Lenovo, obviously, is a big-time player in the computer market. And they have been using this software called Superfish, or they actually call it the Superfish Visual Discovery. It's being put on computers, and it's just causing all kinds of problems. This software is being called Adware spyware because it actually tracks web searches and browsing activity on users' computers, and it puts additional ads on from the sites that users visit. The software also installs its own root certificate and leaves PCs more vulnerable to malware attacks. So even I've read stories that even when a user would disable this app, because it still has that certificate, it leaves people open to man-in-the-middle attacks. So it's a pretty big deal. There's been lawsuits being filed against the companies for violating wiretap laws and trespassing on personal property. Pretty big, pretty high water this company finds themselves in right now.
The software behind it is a company called Comodia, and there's just been a lot of people talking about this the whole week. I wrote a story on it a couple days ago, and at that point I think 35% of all of the information technology cyberfacts that Surfwatch Labs collects were talking about Lenovo and Comodia and Superfish and all that. So it's pretty much the huge story of the week, and obviously because Lenovo is the largest PC seller basically in the entire world, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, they found that there was what basically the issue is these certificates. So they did a search of the decentralized SSL observatory, and they found 1,600 examples where this Comodia software basically is accepting certificates that should have been rejected, with things like Google, Yahoo, Bing, Amazon, eBay, major sites like that. So obviously not all of those might be because of, these man-in-the-middle attacks or cyber criminals, but some of them just could be invalid certificates, but they think that it's kind of unlikely that all of those 1,600 would be invalid. So at the beginning of the week, Lenovo was kind of saying there hasn't really been any of these attacks in the wild, but according to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, at least it seems like they've found some. And basically what that means is that they said it's possible that Comodia's software enabled man-in-the-middle attacks, which could give attackers access to people's email, search histories, social media accounts, e-commerce accounts, bank accounts, and even the ability to install malicious software that could potentially compromise a user's browser history or read their encryption keys. And like I said, since it's the largest PC vendor in the world, obviously that's a pretty wide-reaching problem.
And to add, what I also found that was kind of interesting that just happened a couple of days ago is that our good old friends from Lizard Squad popped up, and they're claiming that they attacked Lenovo's Asian website, but it looks like you just use the DNS redirection attack. Even hacker groups and a lot of people are upset about this. But what I find more interesting is what other sort of, to blow it up and look at from 30,000 feet, what other sort of organization groups put pre-installed software on new PCs, how vulnerable are they to attack, and what do they do? I think this issue brings up a lot of other issues that I think will be explored in the future further.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that, because I was reading this thing this morning about Gemalto, which is the number 2 story, which Matt will tell you about in just a second. But this Chinese spokesperson was basically, outraged that people were sort of compromising these IT products, kind of in a similar vein with this Lenovo or this Gemalto story. And I just thought that was hilarious because, you hear so much about these Chinese companies basically doing the exact same thing. But they just kind of had that fake outrage about, the NSA doing it.
And that's also ironic because the Chinese government is trying to force foreign technology companies into allowing backdoor access to software. So it's sort of a hypocritical thing, but that's just what governments do, I guess.
Yeah, so before we get too deep into that discussion, Matt, do you want to tell us a little bit about Gemalto, which was the number 2 top story of the week?
Yeah, it was the number two top trending new target, and it was actually number 3 behind good old Anthem, which is still going to be in the news, but we've discussed that heavily. After news that the NSA earlier this week or the week before? I can't remember. Maybe you guys know, but there's a big story. NSA was kind of caught with their hand in the cookie jar. They got caught essentially spying on several countries with this, quote, undetectable spyware, and one of the targets that popped up from that was Gemalto, which is, of course, one of the world leaders in SIM card and SIM product production. Both the GCHQ and NSA have been tied to hacking into Gemalto's networks in an effort to steal encryption keys to view messages, conversations, and data traffic. Through a press release, however, Gemalto is kind of downplaying the effect of this attack. They're saying that it was more or less like an office network breach, which meant that, it wasn't like a massive amount of these SIM encryption keys were stolen, but there's a lot of experts that kind of have their doubts about that. Do you guys see anything else with this story that's been playing out? It's a huge story.
Yeah, I thought this week was really interesting just because we have the Lenovo, which is the world's biggest PC seller, and then we have Gemalto, which is the world's biggest SIM manufacturer. So, both these stories are, huge, wide-reaching implications. But I guess the thing everyone's been talking about is that basically after, being told that, the NSA was in their system, I think in 2010, 2011, it only took them 6 days to do a review and basically say, oh, no, everything's all good. Gemalto, we actually spoke to them last week on the podcast. I was hoping to get some comments from them about kind of, what happened in the situation. But in their press release, they basically, they put it out after 6 days and basically said, oh, we're not going to be talking about this anymore ever again. So I think the impression is they just kind of want to sort of bury it and kind of get it behind them. But obviously with sophisticated state-sponsored attacks, it's kind of hard to do an investigation like that in just a couple of days.
Yeah, and with state-sponsored attacks, it's that given the vast amount of resources states can put towards this sort of thing, it's par for the course that this is going to happen. But just to blow it up again to 30,000 feet, this is a big story given that there's an Economist article out in this week's Economist that says by 2020, 80% of adults will have a supercomputer in their pocket or a smartphone of some kind. And if governments can easily compromise SIM card products and stuff like that, it'll open up a whole new area of surveillance or intercepted communications.
Yeah, and basically this whole story started because there was a slide in the leaked sort of Snowden files, whatever you want to call it, where whoever wrote the slide said that they believe they have the entire network basically compromised of Gemalto. So basically you have the NSA or this kind of slide, implying that they basically had all this stuff, and then you have Gemalto kind of saying the opposite. So that's kind of been the debate that's sort of been going on, all week. So those are really the two big stories of the week. But obviously, there's a lot of other stuff that people were talking about as well. Maybe you can fill us in a little bit on that, Matt?
Yeah, another story that happened this week was it involved a ransomware attack, and this is interesting because Jeff and I were lucky enough to talk to several experts, interview them, and get their opinions and views about certain topics. This week we happen to do one on ransomware and should you or should you not pay the ransom demand. But we had a story in an Illinois town. I believe it was a Midlothian. It was a police department. They were attacked with cryptoware, which is a variant of ransomware. The attack was focused on one single computer that contained data that clearly was valuable to the department because they actually paid to the man, which was $500 worth of Bitcoin. So this is, another example. Obviously, they were unprepared. They clearly didn't have their data backed up because, had they did that, there would have been no need to pay the ransom. And another interesting thing with this, and I'm going to go to our article, Jeff. When you read through all the opinions and advice, I think you had your nose. I think that we even had one person compare it to a terrorist. Say, I'm not going to deal with terrorists, so I'm not going to deal with a hacker, through a ransomware attack. But some of the experts also brought up some points where maybe there are times you should pay the ransom. I personally don't think you should ever pay it, but they brought up some decent examples.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting because, basically every time you read an article on ransomware in like a mainstream outlet, like Reuters, New York Times, whatever, it seems like there's always, the expert, the week in there basically saying, oh, never pay ransomware or never pay ransoms in general. But, pretty much everyone we talked to, with the exception of maybe like one or two people, pretty much kind of had, well, you shouldn't pay, but, there's plenty of situations where, it might be beneficial to pay if you haven't done, the preparation, like backing up your files and stuff. And I think it's interesting that with these government stories, that's pretty much all the ones that I can remember. I mean, over the past couple of months, I've probably seen 3 or 4 or half dozen different stories of, government agencies paying ransoms, those small ones. And probably because, they're obviously more public, they kind of have to acknowledge it. But what's interesting is that this ransomware is making, millions and millions of dollars, and you don't really hear very often about people paying it. And not that you should pay it, but obviously, tons of people are paying it if these cyber criminals are making all this money off of it. So it was kind of interesting just to hear everyone's sort of different opinion on situations where maybe you should pay it or shouldn't pay it.
Yeah, I think with just the normal everyday computer user, they would rather, I'm working under the assumption that they don't back up their files, which every week you should. They'll look at it as a cost-benefit analysis where they'll say like, well, it's going to only cost me X amount of money to get out of this, or I could just lose all of my important files, personal stuff. So their incentive is really just, well, just pay it and we'll be done with it and it'll be out of sight, out of mind, rather than dealing with it and going through. So it's more of also the convenience factor given what the effects of ransomware, cryptoware too.
And I'm actually, Jeff, I'm actually, and Mike, sorry, I'm actually writing something on this today. And, one of the things that I'm going to point out, I believe it was Ethan Wall was one of the experts that talked in that article, and he brought up a situation where a hacker gets into a system and retrieves some pretty private, either photos or videos of someone, doing something they clearly do not want leaked out to their social media and their networks and everything like that. I think that brings up a good point. Yeah, you can back up your data, but, then you have these situations where what if all of your stuff was held for hostage and, you didn't want people seeing it? Well, I think people need to start looking at their computer and their online security a little differently. I think we view, we put all this stuff on a computer, naked photos. I don't personally, maybe you guys might not either, but, we hear these stories about iCloud accounts being intercepted, for all these celebrities with all these naked photos and everything. And it's their right, of course. They can go ahead and, do what they want. But if you're going to put all of this private data on a computer, there's a good chance it could be intercepted. So why do it in the first place? I guess is my point. My point with that. I don't know if you guys agree with that or not.
Yeah, I wrote a story. This was back in 2013 when Cassidy Wolf, Miss Teen USA, she was basically sextorted. And it was a pretty public case because she was talking about it at the Miss Teen USA pageant and all that. So it got a lot of media coverage. But Yeah, I kind of looked into it then and, just kind of looked into this sort of, there's some good articles on like Ars Technica and stuff about sort of this sort of underground world where, people are basically hacking into webcams and ransoming people and have these, basically they're called slaves. And, it's kind of, the people who read it, it's kind of scary, for a lot of them. So, and since then we've seen, I think it was just a couple weeks ago, there was I think it was in the UK. There's also another story I know in New York about, police basically talking about these, people like on Skype, you meet a pretty girl on Skype and, they basically get some racy stuff from you and then they try to ransom you and extort you out of it. It's really nothing new, but just kind of with the technology front, I think it's a lot easier for people to kind of fall into that trap. So yeah, I would recommend not doing anything naked online, but
I don't know, for me, it's common sense. But maybe, I don't know, maybe there's something we're missing out on.
Yeah, so those were really the big top 3 stories of the week, or, the big top 2 plus the ransomware one. But, I mean, there's a lot of other stuff happening that I think we can just kind of run through quickly just to update everybody out there who's listening. Target actually released its quarter 4 financial information, and they updated the figures on their breach costs from December 2013. In total, Target has incurred $252 million in costs from the data breach through the end of 2014. $90 million of which is covered by insurance, so their net expense is $162 million due to that breach. But that doesn't include any potential lawsuits or anything. So I was reading the National Law Review, and they said that those expense figures will continue to mount over the course of 2015 as Target continues to deal with ongoing litigation and regulatory fallout from the 2013 data breach. I don't know if you guys read that story or thought it was interesting or had anything to add about that.
Yeah, I saw it. I thought it was interesting. I think it kind of puts into perspective for corporations the ultimate costs of a data breach, especially a corporation as big as Target. But just imagine if you're a small business, what the cost of that breach would be, and what if you didn't have insurance, or how much insurance would be taken off? And I think it kind of puts things into perspective for business people to really take cybersecurity seriously on top of everything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll have to wait and see, because obviously with a lot of the big breaches that have happened too, we'll have to kind of wait and see what those numbers are too, so we can compare to see the severity. I'm really interested to see, how the Home Depot is going to turn out.
Another big story of the week was Anthem. Actually, was the number 2 most discussed target overall. And looking at all the targets and not just the new ones. But they were back in the news a lot this week because it turns out some non-Anthem customers were also affected. Between 8.8 and 18.8 million non-customers were in their database. And these customers were Blue Cross Blue Shield customers. Because basically Anthem is part of a national network so that those Blue Cross Blue Shield customers can receive medical services when they're in an area that isn't served by Blue Cross Blue Shield. So there's between, basically 9 and 19 million customers that aren't Anthem that were affected, bringing the total up to possibly as many as 100 million customers, which is a pretty astounding number. And just to recap, that includes personal information such as names, birthdays, medical IDs, social security numbers, addresses, email addresses, employment information, income data. All that could potentially be compromised for them. Yeah, so I thought that was an interesting story because yesterday, on Thursday, the Medical Identity Fraud Alliance actually released its 5th annual study on medical ID theft. And they found that in 2014, more than 2 million Americans were victims of medical ID theft. And that's an increase of 22% over 2013. And 63% of those victims that they surveyed paid more than $13,000 in out-of-pocket costs to resolve the crime. So obviously a lot of people are being impacted by this. And then we wonder with, potentially as many as 100 million more having their information out there, what's going to happen. But I know, Matt, you kind of wrote a story about Anthem and ID theft earlier this week.
Yeah, and it's what I focused on and what really bothered me with that breach was there were millions of children who potentially are going, had their ID stolen. And, child ID theft is a pretty serious problem. I wasn't aware of how serious it was till I started actually digging into some stats. According to a 2012 child identity theft report, children are targeted 35 times more than adults for their ID. And one of the there's a couple reasons why I found. Number one, a child's credit report, for instance, is clean. It has no blemishes, so there's not going to be a lot of problem with it. And also, because it's a child's credit report, it's really doubtful that, credit reporting agencies are going to be monitoring it, which means that the criminal can use that information a lot longer than with like an adult's ID. It's a pretty big problem. And I didn't realize how big of a problem this actually was till I started digging into some of the stats for it.
Yeah, and like you said, parents generally, don't really monitor. You're not going to monitor your 3-year-old's credit because they shouldn't have any credit, right?
Right, exactly, right.
So a couple of tips that we read and kind of found this week that everyone seems to sort of agree on, all the different agencies and such, is just kind of to know the warning signs. Obviously if you're getting credit card offers or any kind of offers involving that, for your children, that's likely because there might be something wrong. So that's one warning sign. You get collection calls, the IRS notifies you being turned down to government benefits because the Social Security number's been used. Anything like that is a warning sign. So you can check your child's credit report. In most situations, they won't have a credit report yet because they shouldn't have, got any credit yet if they're still a child. In some states, there's laws that you can actually create an empty credit report for your children and then do a credit freeze on it. So that's, one good solution if you're worried about it, but that only applies in some states, so that's something you have to kind of check in on, depending on what state you live in. Moving on, we have an interview with Incapsula's Tim Matthews. I spoke to him a couple weeks ago. We just haven't had a chance to put it on the podcast yet, but we talked about botnets, cyber legislation related to those botnets, and DDoS trends and attacks. To kick it off, I guess, what's your impression of like the new cybersecurity legislation that people are talking about, particularly the stuff, having to do with prosecuting the sale of botnets and shutting down those engaged in DDoS and things like that?
Yeah, so prosecuting the sale of bots or botnets is very interesting. It's, to me, akin to criminalizing gun running, because before it was illegal to break into someone's site, but there was really nothing specific about the people who provided all the tools for people to do that. And now people can be, prosecuted for selling botnets, which are the main weapon of choice for bringing down websites and hacking into them.
I was reading the book about the Configure worm recently, and I guess the impression I got from that is that it's pretty much impossible to stop a botnet. They were throwing all these resources and all these smart people at it, and at the end, the botnet is still around and it was still doing damage. Just wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about that.
You're right. It's very difficult to stop the actions of botnets, such a large, overwhelming source. But what's interesting about this legislation is that now when they actually find the people who are responsible for creating the botnets, the so-called bot herders, they will, if this is actually put into law, actually have a really strong weapon to prosecute the person. The biggest issue is that it's so easy to rent a botnet, and so it's easy for anybody to just search online and find these tools and bots available for a fee. It's really, unfortunately, it's software as a service, but it's hacking software. Now, at least, there is going to be some kind of impediment in place, or people will think twice at least about actually selling botnets because there are spelled out criminal penalties. And if it's even a little bit harder for anybody who wants to hack into or bring down a website, if it's a little harder for them to get a hold of these tools, I think that will at least make a bit of difference in people's ability to protect their sites, because there won't be as many people out there with these weapons.
Yeah, another thing a lot of people have been talking about recently is, sort of sharing between, the government and the private sector. I'm just kind of wondering if you have any thoughts on that, because when I talk to people, they seem to kind of come down on two sides. There's a lot of people think it's a good idea, but at the same time, it's like, well, what should we be sharing and how useful is the sharing?
Yeah, I think that public-private partnership is always a good thing. I think there's information that the private sector has that's interesting for the government and vice versa. I think it's really important that this kind of crime, cybercrime in general, and then specifically, botnets and hacking attempts, has risen to the level where it's become, a national security issue, and President Obama has already made some pronouncements, and we'll be speaking again later this week, in fact tomorrow, about a new department and what his plans are. So I think that it's a good thing that the government has finally gotten to the point where they realize how important it is to protect the economy. And so I'm sure that we're going to be doing more sharing of data. And I don't think it can hurt. I think that we each know things the other doesn't know, and I think that will benefit all of us, as individual citizens and as businesses.
I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about just kind of about botnets in general, and over the past few years, what you guys have seen. Are you seeing a lot more growth, or kind of any trends or things kind of concerning that area? Yeah, there's
a few things that have changed when it comes to bots and the bots that make up the botnets. The first is that the original target for a machine to be taken over and made into a bot, the so-called zombie, was the PC, the end user's computers. And people's perception is that there are tens of thousands or even millions of these machines that have been taken over. The trend that we've seen recently is that the target is no longer the end user's PC, but it's a server. And the reason is because now there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of servers, and they have really high-speed connections. And so the alarming trend is that now the guys who are creating botnets and infecting machines to become bots are targeting all the servers out there that are connected to really fast bandwidth, which means that the size of the attacks and the frequency of attacks has increased significantly. We've seen, for example, a doubling in the size of DDoS or denial of service attacks in the last year. And the reason is because there's just a lot more volume of bandwidth and machines out there to mount even bigger attacks than ever before.
From a business perspective, you're a business owner, you're using, some of these servers. Is there anything out there that people are doing wrong or that they should be wary of or should know about in terms of kind of to stop them from becoming part of a botnet?
Yeah, so people need to be aware of two things. First is everybody who runs, a significant website that's at least in front of sensitive data and also is concerned about becoming part of a botnet needs to have what's called a web application firewall. This is not a brand new concept, but a relatively new concept. Just like a network firewall keeps the bad guys out of your network, web application firewall, or WAF as it's called, keeps the bad guys from probing and infecting and even taking over your website or web server. And so not everyone, I think, is aware of that. The other thing is, this is boring and it's been said for a long time, but people need to be vigilant about patching their servers, especially servers that are based on WordPress, which is a common CMS or blog platform. There are vulnerabilities reported all the time, and the amount of people who don't patch their systems is really, really high. And so either you've got to do it, or you've got to go with a hoster or have a consultant who will do these patches for you, because people are wide open to really significant vulnerabilities that have been reported a long time ago, and they're not doing anything about it.
This is the question I ask a lot of people, and a lot of times these vulnerabilities will come out and the patches will come out and, it'll be a year later and there's still a huge percentage of people that are unpatched. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on why that is. Is it just, ignorance on the people's part, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think that it's a combination of things. Ignorance, doesn't sound flattering, but I think people are just unaware of a lot of the patches. There have just been so many incidents that it's really tough to keep up with all the different patches to vulnerabilities. So that's one aspect. The second is, people are busy, especially, small, mid-sized business owners are just busy running their business. And so keeping up with patches, I think, is something that they're not always having time to do or don't have the priority correct on. And then I think the last one is, a lot of times you are the victim of a crime you're not even aware of. So somebody could have compromised your server, or they could have installed what's called a backdoor on your server, and maybe you're being used as a botnet and you don't even know it, or part of a botnet. So I think there are a lot of people out there who'd be surprised to learn that the machines are already infected. They just haven't had any data stolen, or they're not aware that data's been stolen. So maybe they don't feel like they're the victim of a crime yet, or haven't had any kind of business impact yet. But time is the enemy of all folks who think they're secure, because eventually something's going to happen.
Everyone's always talking about DDoS attacks. So just wondering if you can maybe talk about kind of what you guys see out there in the landscape and how it impacts different businesses.
Sure. So, if you think about the bad things that could happen to a business as it relates to security, one is a big data breach. And, if you're the target of an attack that breaches your data, there are well-stipulated penalties and procedures in terms of having to publicize, and it's hurt a lot of businesses, Target, Home Depot, there are others that have been mentioned. DDoS is a bit different because it's essentially being offline for some period of time. And so, depending on your business, that could have reputational impacts. It could also have financial impacts, especially if your business depends on being online. If you are an e-commerce vendor or a gaming vendor, we've actually measured the impact in terms of what it costs per hour. And the average cost that we found in our recent survey was $40,000 per hour. And so if you think about that, DDoS is a big problem. And, preventing DDoS attacks really is something like buying insurance. It's a lot less expensive to buy some kind of DDoS prevention service or appliance than it is to be offline for a couple hours, or in some cases a couple days, if you're suffering from a really bad attack.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on just any trends or anything that sort of stand out, just kind of in the whole cybersecurity space in general. With the turn of the new year, everyone's kind of talking about different trends and sort of things that are happening. And is there anything that really stands out to you that's maybe the most concerning when it comes to businesses?
Yeah, so as it relates to DDoS, we are definitely seeing a significant increase in the size of attacks. So it used to be that a 10 gigabit per second attack was pretty big. Now we routinely see attacks of 100, 200, 300 gigabits per second. And so that's a lot of bandwidth, and that's beyond most companies' networks. And so the growth in size means that you could very easily be taken out. This is kind of like, going back to my original analogy to, gun running. This is an arms race where the weapons that the bad guys are using are even more powerful than ever before. And so it means that you can't just rely on having extra bandwidth or having an appliance, in your data center. You've got to figure out another way to use the cloud and the economies of scale to protect yourself. The other thing that we're seeing a lot more of is people who are infected but don't know it. So people whose machines have been taken over or who have backdoors installed. We routinely work with clients and we monitor not just the inbound traffic of attacks, but the outbound traffic from a compromised machine back to its command and control center. And we're seeing a lot of people who have been compromised and don't even know it. So that's a kind of an alarming trend that people aren't even aware that their servers have been already impacted.
Another topic that's in the news quite a bit lately is ransomware. And that's, kind of related to DDoS because there's, DDoS ransom as well. And
yep.
We've just been asking a few people this question of if they ever find there's, a good reason that you should pay the ransom. Because I've seen a few stories recently where different governments have, had ransomware on the computers and, they've paid to recover the data. So just wondering your thoughts on that. Is there ever a sort of a good time to pay a ransom?
So we never recommend paying ransomware. It's a little different for DDoS than it is if someone has encrypted all your files, for example. But in the case of DDoS attacks, what we found is that when you pay off somebody, since they don't have to give anything back, what they'll typically do is just up the ante or mark you as somebody who is an easy mark who can be extorted in the future. They're basically saying we're not going to attack you if you pay us, and so if you do pay them, there really is no guarantee they won't attack you again. You're not getting your files back. You're not getting anything in return for the money. So we don't really see any benefit to paying the attacker. In fact, we see the negative effect of people charging more money or coming back around. And just like organized crime, wants protection money, you might find yourself paying regular protection money, not just a one-time ransom fee.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering if you have any sense of like how many people are actually paying this, because you see these news stories, and obviously it's successful because they talk about, these millions of dollars being made, and it's a tactic that keeps, reoccurring. So just wondering if you have any sense at all of that.
Yeah, so a couple things. So first of all, we see DDoS attacks mounted for really three main reasons. One is extortion using the ransom note technique. The second one is hacktivism, trying to raise awareness for your cause, and a lot of the notorious hacker groups have been mounting DDoS attacks against companies and governments to support a given cause. And the third one is competition. We see a lot of DDoS attacks mounted against competitors, especially in gaming and online gambling and similar types of businesses, where if someone else is down, you can get their business, and it's worth it to actually mount an attack. So coming back to ransomware, people typically will admit that they received a ransom note when they don't pay it. So we've seen, last year a number of SaaS businesses who actually tweeted that they were under attack and received a ransom demand. We don't hear a lot about people admitting that they paid ransomware to prevent DDoS attacks. So we don't really know how many people, have paid it. I suspect a lot of people have paid it and not admitted it. A lot of the ransom demands are pretty low, and the reason is because they want the person receiving it to be able to pay it without needing approval from a manager and, raising people's awareness of what's going on. So a lot of the people that pay don't ever admit it because that's the whole design.
All right. Well, thank you for taking the time, Tim. Appreciate it.
All right. Likewise. Good talking to you again.
All right. Well, that's it for this week's Cybercrime and Business Podcast. Thanks, everyone out there, for listening. As always, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you listen so you don't miss any episodes. And check out hacksurfer.com and surfwatchlabs.com for more information.